Shalom. I want to give all praises, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Bahashem, Yahabashai, Bahashem, Rakha Hudash. I want to give double honors to the apostles and elders of Great Millstone, because those are the men who I learned this truth from through the spirit and power of Yahweh, Bahashem, Yahabashai. Yahweh is the true name of the God of Israel. Yahabashai is who the world ignorantly calls Jesus Christ, but his one and only true name is Yahabashai. And pretty much you always hear people use Paul and Barnabas, splitting up, to spread the same gospel to the Israelite foreigners, because that was both of their lot. They often use that situation that they never break down to fuel rebellion and being wise in your own conceits, and ultimately, just to do your own thing pretty much. And there's a reason why Paul didn't want to take Mark, all right, which in scriptures they call him John Mark, which is the same author of the book of Mark, which was Peter's scribe, all right, writing down Peter's account. So in this video, I'm going to pretty much go over why Apostle Paul felt like that. He didn't want to bring Mark on that particular journey, right? And also Apostle Paul, his mindset changed towards Mark and he forgave him, all right? So without further ado, we're going to get straight into it, because we have to understand these scriptures and we got to interpret it correctly. So now let's get into it. So now we got to figure out who is John Mark, or Mark, right? So this is from gotquestions.org. Who is John Mark in the Bible? It says John Mark, often just called Mark, is the author of the Gospel of Mark, which was Peter's scribe, right? He was a believer in the early church, which when you read in the scriptures, all throughout the New Testament, when it says the word church, it's going to be strong G. I believe it's 1577, don't quote me, but it's the word ecclesia. One of the definitions, it says an assembly of Israelites. When you read Apostle Paul's epistles, meaning his letters, right, it's written to what? His brethren. You go into the Greek word for brethren, it's adelphos, which means he's talking to the people that have the same common ancestor as him, which is the seed of the promise, all right? Which is the Israelites, the so-called Negroes, Hispanics, and Native American Indians, our seed line, all right? So when you read all throughout the New Testament, the word saints, believers, all these words is to let you know that it's only referring to Israelites by seed, all right? Whether it be Jews that was raised up in Judea or Jerusalem in the promised land, or outside of it, which the ones that was outside of it, when you read the book of Acts, the 2nd chapter, is Israelite foreigners, all right? That was there scattered amongst the heathen from previous captivities due to what? The curses of our disobedience in Deuteronomy chapter 28. So we were scattered as a people, but you have a remnant of Jacob that's still within these heathen territories, all right? So continuing on. So it says, mentioned directly only in the book of Acts. John Mark is first mentioned as the son of a woman named Mary in the book of Acts chapter 12, verse 12, whose house was being used as a place for believers to gather and pray. Later, Mark is mentioned as a companion of Barnabas and Paul, right? Now, Barnabas and Paul, they had the same lot, but the scriptures focus more on Paul's voyages, all right? But Barnabas, he taught the Israelite foreigners as well. He had a heavy lot as well. Continuing on, it says, during their travels together, Acts chapter 12, verse 25, John Mark was also Barnabas' cousin. When you read Colossians 4 and 10, which I have these scriptures lined up, the Colossians, it says, John Mark was a helper on Paul and Barnabas' first missionary, Acts chapter 13, verse 5. However, he did not stay through the whole trip. This is why Apostle Paul didn't want to take him on that particular journey, all right? There's a reason why he felt like that. People just jump to conclusions. Continuing on, it says John Mark deserted Paul. That's why Paul didn't want to take him on that particular journey. We're going to read it in the scriptures. You can't just be reading the scriptures to make it match, your negative emotion. Continuing on, it says, deserted Paul and Barnabas in Pamphylia and left the work. Acts 15:38. So this is why Paul and Barnabas got into it, because Paul is like, look, this dude already deserted us. We can't depend on him. He might do it again. But Barnabas, which he gonna live up to his name, as I'm gonna go into, plus that was his cousin, right, Mark, he's like, have mercy upon him, right? But continuing on, it says, the Bible does not say why Mark deserted, but his departure came right after a mostly fruitless time in Cyprus. That's in Acts chapter 13, verses 4 through 12. It says only one conversion and recorded in Cyprus, but there had been strong demonic opposition. So we don't know exactly, according to the scriptures, why Mark deserted Paul and Barnabas, but that could have been part of the reason. All right. It says it could be that the young John Mark was discouraged at the hardness of the way and decided to return to the comforts of home. And that happens to particular men. All right. The scriptures also mention how a just man falleth 7 times, he get back up. So as long as you're an Israelite, you can repent and try to do better. But once you start teaching, you made a vow to the Most High, Ecclesiastes 5:4, and you have to pay it with your life as a living sacrifice through faith in YAHSHAWAR. All right. It says, let's read some more. It says, sometime later, after Paul and Barnabas had returned from their first journey, Paul expressed a desire to go back to the brothers in the cities they had previously visited to see how everyone was doing. This is in Acts chapter 15, verse 36. Barnabas agreed, apparently upon the provision that they take John Mark with them. Paul refused to have Mark on the trip. However, citing Mark's previous desertion, right, how he deserted them, how he left, Paul and Barnabas had a sharp disagreement about John Mark. Verse 39, Acts 15:39. It says, and wound up separating from each other and going on their separate journeys. Barnabas took John Mark with him to Cyprus, and Paul took Silas with him through Syria and Cilicia to encourage the believers in the churches in those areas. That's in Acts 15, verses 39 through 41. All right. We're going to read some more. It says, Barnabas, the son of encouragement, right? Acts 4:36. I got that. Desired to forgive John Mark's failure and to give him another chance. Paul took the more rational view. Pioneering missionary work requires dedication, resolve, and endurance. It says Paul saw John Mark as a risk to their mission. Luke, the writer of Acts, does not take sides or present either Paul or Barnabas as being in the right. It says he simply records the facts. It's worth noting that in the end, 2 groups of missionaries were sent out. Twice as many missionaries were spreading the gospel. And that's what it's all about. Even here at Great Millstone, that's what we push. We teach that there's elect amongst other camps. All right. There's other camps outside of Great Millstone that's doing the work. It's just that when they go off according to the gospel and doctrine, we have to rebuke and correct them, or else the blood will be on our hands. That's in Ezekiel the 3rd chapter, right? So it says John Mark sails off to Cyprus with his cousin Barnabas, but that is not the end of his story. Years later, he is with Paul, who calls him a fellow worker. That's in Philemon 1:24. It says, and near the end of Paul's life, Paul sends a request to Timothy from a Roman prison, get Mark and bring him with you, because he is helpful to me in the ministry. All right, so Mark, he redeemed himself by going with Barnabas. All right, that made Paul trust him again, because Paul was serious about doing the work. Remember Paul's spirit, I believe it's either 1st or 2nd Corinthians, the 9th chapter, where it says a dispensation of the gospel has been committed unto me, woe to me. pretty much if I don't fulfill my office. So that's the type of zeal that Apostle Paul had. All right. And that's the type of energy he spread to his disciples and the believers. So that's why he was pissed off at Mark, because he looked at that as being lukewarm. All right. Continuing on, it says, yep, because he is helpful to me in the ministry, 2 Timothy 4:11. So Paul ended up forgiving him. It says, obviously, John Mark had matured through the years and had become a faithful servant of the Lord. Paul recognized his progression and considered him a valuable companion. It says John Mark, right, known as the Book of Mark, St. Mark, wrote the gospel that bears his name sometime between AD 55 and 59. There could be a vile reference to John Mark in Mark chapter 14, verses 51 to 52. In that passage, a young man rose up from the sleep on the night that Yahushua was arrested, attempts to follow the Lord, and the mob who had Yahushua in custody attempts to seize him. The young man escapes and flees into the night. The fact that this incident is only recorded in Mark's gospel, and the fact that the young man is anonymous, has led some scholars to surmise that the fleeing young man is actually John Mark. All right. So, just remember that Mark, he was Peter's understudy as well. So now, let's get into the scriptures. So let's start off with that, right? So this is Acts chapter 15, verse 36, and now this is dealing with what? Second missionary journey, right? Because they were spreading the gospel all throughout Asia Minor, and as those Israelite foreigners that was looked at as uncircumcised heathen, right? Because of their uncircumcision, because of their paganism, living outside of the land of Israel, right? As their faith increased, more churches started to build up all over Asia Minor, all right? So Acts 15:36, and some days after Paul said unto Barnabas, let us go again and visit our brethren, right? Now, let's go into this word brethren, because, Christians and people in general, they don't understand that Paul, Barnabas, the different men of the Lord, they was only dealing with Israelites. Only Israelites is meant to receive this gospel and be made wise unto salvation. And that's predestination, all right? So it says the word brethren in Acts 15:36 is adelphos, as I said earlier. And it says what? A brother, whether born of the same two parents or only of the same father or mother, it says having the same national ancestor. So this is who Paul is talking to. He's talking to the seed of the promise. Didn't he say in Romans 11:1 that he come from the tribe of Benjamin, from the stock of Abraham? He's talking to the seed of the promise. That's who his letters is addressed to. That's who Paul, Barnabas, the different men of the Lord, that's who they go and teach, the seed of the promise. That's who the gospel is for. So it says having the same national ancestor, which would be who? The fathers of the promise, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It says belonging to the same people or countrymen, all right? So it says in every city, because you had Israelites that was in every city of Asia Minor, all right? Whether it be Rome, Philippi, Colossae, Ephesus, all over. Corinthians, or Corinth, Athens, Greece, all over, right? Cyprus, all over that land of Asia Minor. It says where we have preached the word of the Lord, and see how they do, right? See how these people react. It says, and Barnabas determined to take with them John, whose surname was Paul, right? Now let's just go into this, right? Greek word Marcos. Yep. It says Mark, the word Mark, it means a defense, right? It says an evangelist, the author of the Gospel of Mark. Marcus was his Latin surname. His Israelite name was John or Yochanan. It says he was a cousin of Barnabas, right? So this is another reason why Barnabas felt some type of pity towards him, because that's his family. All right. And plus, he was young during that time. So he was discouraged. It says, and a companion of Paul in some of his missionary journeys. All right? So it's letting you know, to verify what I'm saying, that this John, whose surname was Mark, this is the same author of the book of St. Mark, all right? Which was Peter's scribe. But continuing on, though, it says, but Paul thought not good to take him with them, who departed from them from Pamphylia, and went not with them to do the work. So this is why Paul was discouraged in the beginning. He's like, yo, he deserted us. We can't rely on this guy. He might do it again. It says, and the contention was so sharp between them that they departed asunder one from another. And so Barnabas took Mark and sailed unto Cyprus. It says, and Paul chose Silas and departed, being recommended by the brethren unto the grace of YASHAMIAHLA. Let's read that in the NLT real quick. This is Acts 15 in the NLT, verse 37. It says, Barnabas agreed and wanted to take John Mark, but Paul disagreed strongly, since John Mark had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not continued with them in their work. It says their disagreement was so sharp that they separated. Barnabas took John Mark with him and sailed for Cyprus. Paul chose Silas, so Paul replaced Mark, right? It says, and as he left, the believers entrusted to the Lord's gracious care. So Silas, he was a man that could be trusted. He was recommended, right? It says, then he traveled throughout Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches there, right? Strengthening the assembly of Israelites there, all right? So now, let's read this. So I typed in Paul and Barnabas parting ways, right? Let's see what pops up on the AI overview. It says Paul and Barnabas split because of sharp disagreement over John Mark during their second missionary journey, as recorded in Acts 15:36-39. The cause of the split, past desertion. John Mark left the team during their first missionary journey in Pamphylia. It says Paul's view. Paul felt John Mark was unreliable and refused to bring him again. Barnabas' view. It says Barnabas wanted to give John Mark a second chance. He was also his cousin. The resulting teams, right? Barnabas and Mark sailed together to Cyprus. Paul and Silas traveled through Syria and Cilicia. Missionary growth, or ministry growth, right? It says the single team became two distant missionary groups. Later letters from Paul suggest a personal rift was later healed. Why? Because Apostle Paul forgave him, because he was doing the work. He had one short slip up, referring to John Mark, St. Mark, and as he matured in the truth, he got better. He understood the seriousness of it, and he kept on teaching. All right? This is Acts chapter 4, verse 36. It says, for instance, there was Joseph, the one the apostles nicknamed Barnabas, which means son of encouragement, right? He was from the tribe of Levi and came from the islands of Cyprus. So Barnabas, he was a Levite, all right? His surname was Barnabas, which was a nickname that was given unto him, which means son of encouragement, all right? So his name was Joseph. So there you go, man. Everything is spiritual with these names, by the way. Joseph, Barnabas, which Barnabas' name means son of encouragement. He was from the tribe of Levi, right? So that's what he did. He gave Mark some encouragement. He lived up to his name. Gave him another chance through grace. So I typed in, why did Barnabas like John Mark? I was just doing research, right? AI overview. Barnabas wanted to bring John Mark because they were cousins. And Barnabas, known as the son of encouragement, believed in giving Israelites, second chances after John Mark left their first missionary journey early. seeing potential for his future usefulness rather than letting the past failure define him. So you gotta give brothers a chance, you know? Brothers ain't always gonna be perfect. It don't matter how great you think somebody is, the great works they did through faith. We in the flesh at the end of the day. It's still no excuse, you know, to willingly sin and stuff like that. But, you know, brothers is in the flesh. They're gonna fall sometime. As long as they get back up and pray. Reasons for Barnabas' support, family relationship. In Colossians 4:10, it notes that John Mark was the cousin or nephew of Barnabas, creating a natural family bond and loyalty. Heart for encouragement, Acts 4:36. It says, calls Barnabas the son of encouragement, and he had a history of championing people others doubted, right? So he was known as to give people encouragement that had hard times and spiritual lows. When everybody else turned their back on them, Barnabas was the type of dude that would uplift you and motivate you, give you some encouragement, all right, some exhortation to be better, right? It says, and he had a history of championing people others doubted, such as when he first vouched for Paul, Saul in Jerusalem. Belief in second chances. It says, even though John Mark had left the first missionary team at Pamphylia, Barnabas believed that failure was not final and wanted to mentor him back into active service. All right. That's why I typed in, why did Paul think Mark was unreliable? We already know this by now, but it's good to just drill it in your head, right? It says, Paul thought John Mark was unreliable because Mark had left the gospel, right? Let's go down here. Right, during their first missionary journey in Pamphylia and returned to Jerusalem instead of finishing the work. So you got to finish the work. That's important, all right? It says, yep. Yeah, so I mean, we pretty much understand this already. We pretty much understand this. I don't need to keep on reading that. Now check this out. This is 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse, I'm going to start at verse 9. Now this is proof that what? Paul eventually forgave John Mark. Remember, Mark at that particular time and generation, he was young. So he was discouraged at everything that they had to go through. All right? There was a lot of demons in Cyprus, a lot of paganism. So him as a young man, he was discouraged. All right? But that's what happens. You know, you mature over time in the truth. 2 Timothy 4:9, do thy diligence to come shortly unto me, for Demas hath forsaken me. So Demas was a person that used to be a disciple of Apostle Paul. And then it's going to tell you that what? Forsaken me, having loved this present world. He went back into the world. All right? He forsaken the truth. He forsaken the God of Israel and the Messiah. And is departed unto Thessalonica, Christians to Galatia, Titus unto Dalmatia. Only Luke is with me. Take Mark and bring him with thee, for he is profitable to the ministry. So Paul eventually forgave Mark. All right? And he vouched for Mark that this person is profitable for the ministry, meaning he was active. All right? It says, so that's it with that. And I'm going to just finish it off with this. This is Colossians chapter 4 and verse 10. It says, Aristocrus, my fellow prisoner, saluteth you, right? Because Paul was in prison, all right? A lot of his letters, it came from when Paul was in prison. He was in jail. Even in jail, he was converting people. When you read Acts 16, the Philippian jailer, right? Which, by the way, the Philippian jailer, he was an Israelite. Continuing on, it says, yep, saluteth you and Marcus, sister's son to Barnabas, right? Touching whom ye receive commandments. If he come unto you, receive him. All right. So Paul, he vouched for Mark, known as Marcus. All right. And this scripture is proof that Barnabas and Mark, they were cousins. All right. Or yeah, sister, son, you know, nephew, uncle. I mean, the point is they're related. You get it by now. So Lord willing, you was edified by the lesson. Shalom.